Hello and welcome back to our webinar series on mastering Ftrack's API. This is the final session in the series, session 5. We're going to be talking about advanced topics and practical implementation in the API. Previous sessions focused on the basics, interaction, querying, as well as file location management. We all love that stuff. And we published those sessions on YouTube if you need them. And the same for this session. It will be available once we're finished. And I'll get links out to the previous ones in the chat towards the end as well. Once again, I'm Michael Sears. I'm an account manager for the Americas here at Backlight. Been with the Ftrack for 3 years. Seth Gibson has been for us for a while too. He's going to be running the bulk of the webinar. Solutions Delivery Engineer is his title. Extensive background in game dev, 3D viz, extended reality, other pipe development. Many of you have probably met him outside of these sessions as well. Once again, please use the Q&A anytime throughout the presentation. We'll try to respond in real time, but once again, longer answers while for Q&A session, so we'll put the question up on the screen for the one that's currently being answered, and then we'll go through them as much as we can. And that's all for intros. You all know how this works at this point, so let's begin. Over to you, Seth.
All right, thank you very much. And once again, thank you everybody for joining us for this, the last of this round of API webinars. And hopefully we'll be continuing these in the new year with more specific topics. But for now, let's get going on this. So like Michael said, we are at session 5. We will be discussing a couple of advanced topics. This session specifically will be looking at how we handle plugins and how you develop plugins and how that all kind of fits together in the Ftrack ecosystem. So we'll look at things like Ftrack Connect, and then we'll dive a little bit down into what it looks like to implement either a custom integration, any sort of plugin, not from a super deep technical level. This is going to be more concepts and ideas, and we'll look at nomenclature and terminology that we use just to kind of give you a bit of a companion to what's on the developer hub. So if you are maybe looking at the documentation on how to implement your own Connect plugins, or if you've started to dive into our integration sample project because you're interested in integrating your own software, this will hopefully prepare you for some of the things that you'll come across there. Once again, we are Michael and Seth, and thank you again for joining us. So let's get going. So we're going to start with looking at a very high level at kind of what makes up a plugin in the Ftrack environment. And we throw this term around quite a bit, but there are actually different levels and different types of, let's say, code that is plugin-like. And so kind of like we did last Thursday, one of the things we'd like to do here is disambiguate some of those terms. So when you see plugin, when you see extension, when you see tool, you'll kind of understand that while they might share a common base, they do all have specific functions, and they do all fit into the Ftrack environment and ecosystem in a specific way. So no conversation about plugins in the Ftrack ecosystem would be complete without a discussion of Ftrack Connect. And for the purposes of this webinar and going forward, we will be talking about Connect version 3 and the underlying framework version 2. Those of you who have been with us for a while might remember Connect 2 and the earlier framework. Those were ended of life quite a while ago. So going forward, everything that we discuss will be in the Connect 3 and Framework 2 environment. So if we do bring up some terms that you might not be familiar with, or if we talk about some files and file formats that maybe seem a little odd, it's because these are things that have been changed between Connect 2 and Connect 3. And we do have a full migration guide for that. So let's start at the top with the Ftrack Connect desktop application. And if you've used Ftrack at all, you're probably familiar with Connect. Maybe you've used it to set up your storage scenario. Maybe you're actually using it in production to publish. So as a developer who's interested in extending Ftrack and building custom functionality, what you need to know about Ftrack Connect is that first and foremost, it's not an API. Now, if you have been developing against the Ftrack environment for a little bit, you might remember that in Ftrack Connect 2, the division of functionality between plugin code and custom code, for example, and what was actually Connect was a little nebulous. So there might have been times where you went into the Connect source to, at the very least, get some reference on how something was being launched or how data was being passed between different boundaries. But in Connect 3, this has all been siloed pretty well. So we like to think now that Connect 3 is really just that desktop application, which you're using to install plugins, to maybe do standalone publishes, and other related tasks. And as we alluded to in our last session, it's nice to have for some things, but it's not. But for some things, it's also required. So, for example, when you configure a storage scenario, when you first start Ftrack on, say, a fresh deployment, you run Connect, it's going to ask you to set up your storage scenario. And from then on, once that storage scenario is loaded, as we mentioned last week, you can interact with that location directly through the API in your session. Now, it is possible to write a completely standalone publish step yourself, minus Connect, but Connect does provide some really interesting boilerplates that you can take advantage of if you use the plugin framework. And so we do recommend that, unless you have a very, very specific case for kind of doing an end run there, that you do use framework too. As I mentioned, Connect itself is not the API. The API that you'll be using is our framework API. And of course, Connect can be installed as an executable, or you can build from source and run it as a Python module, which is very handy when it comes to development and debugging and inspecting code. So Connect provides two key pieces that you'll need to know about as a developer. The first one is the application launcher, and this does a couple things. The first thing that it does is this is where you set up your environment to launch a DCC from Connect. So one of the things that is key to that is a piece of technology called the launcher hook, which is a YAML file, and we'll look at the different kind of YAML and configuration files later. If you've looked at the integrations repo, or if you have an integration running, you might have noticed a file, say, for example, called Maya_launch.yaml. Well, that's what provides all the environment information to the application launcher. And the application launcher also is essentially the application launcher widget, which presents all the applications that you have integrations loaded for. So Maya, Photoshop, Premiere, Unreal, whatever it is that you're using or whatever it is that you have installed, and will be presented in that menu. And you can support multiple versions of different applications. So for example, if you're running 3 different versions of Maya, or you're running 2 versions of Unreal, those can all be exposed and selectively launched. So it's not going to default to a specific version. It's going to ask you which version of that application you want to launch. The next little bit you need to know about, again, the subject of this is the plugin manager. And the plugin manager does exactly what it sounds like it does. And probably if you've ever used any other plugin-based software, it's very familiar. It discovers and registers the plugins, kind of goes through a similar path that we discussed when we were discussing actions and events. So if you remember the discover and the launch hooks, for example, this is also present here. And it's kind of an interesting aside to how the Ftrack ecosystem and API is all very, very connected. So once you're familiar with writing actions and events, it's not a far cry or a far step to start writing full plugins that maybe encapsulate multiple pieces of functionality, or as we like to say, extends an integration, which is probably the most common use case. And like the action launcher, this also provides its own manager widget, which just exposes your plugins either from the default location, or as we've noted here, there's an environment variable you can set, Ftrack Connect plugin path, which is especially handy for development purposes. So you can segment or silo out your development code and then have your production code in different places. And the plugin manager widget also presents options to install and update any plugins from either your local, your remote, or our own repos. So let's talk about framework now. So I mentioned that there are 2 things we want to talk about here. We want to talk about what's called Ftrack Connect, which we just ran over. Ftrack Connect is powered by our framework, and the framework now, we are on framework version 2. And as I mentioned earlier, framework version 1 and framework version 2 are markedly different. So let's take a look at what framework 2 does. And From a high level, it actually does a lot of the same stuff. So the paradigms haven't really changed much. There are some common components of a framework that we've listed here. So the host, the client, the event manager, and the registry. And the host is what is the code that you're actually running within your DCC app. So for example, when you have a Maya integration, you launch Maya from say Connect, and what you're running is that sets up a host code, which the real key thing that it does is it manages the events. So Ftrack, like everything in our situation, or sorry, framework, and Connect, like everything in our ecosystem, are very event based, and so the host is really what manages handling and dispatching those different events. And then of course we have the client, which is what catches the information from the host. So there's kind of a synergistic relationship here. The client is what actually manages the interaction between the host and the DCC. So the host provides dispatches the event, client catches that event, and will provide specific information back to the host, primarily things like environment information, any sort of customization that your code running in your DCC plugin needs to know about, that sort of thing. And then of course this is all facilitated by the event manager, which again is managed by the host. So not to sound like a broken record, but host asks, client returns, and this all runs through the event manager. And the last little component here for this level is what we call the plugin registry, which is essentially just what manages your installed extensions. So this is what makes the system aware of any code that you have, any custom code that you want to run as a plugin that you want to be exposed to Connect or through the Connect environment. And it also provides some default extensions for you. So when you get a fresh install, out of the box, this is the registry already comes pre-populated with some things that you can get started with. So now, as we go down a layer, we're getting more and more into the actual working of the inner workings of the code itself that you're going to be that's going to be running. And we'll actually touch on some of this a little further down when we actually look at how this all actually kind of flows in the context of, say, an integration. But for now, what we need to know is engine, tools, tool config, and plugin. And as I mentioned, there's that term plugin. So we'll disambiguate what that is at this level, and then, like I said, later we'll explain the difference between a plugin and a tool and an extension. But going back to the top, the engine, as you can probably imagine, is pretty much the main driver of the whole execution flow of a plugin. So when I have either a plugin or a flow of plugins, a sequence of plugins that all encapsulate a specific custom function in my integration, those are all run by our engine. And the engine, as I mentioned, is responsible for running plugins and tools. Now, a tool is what you would think of as maybe what you would think of as a plugin. The tool is where the actual work happens. So if you were to say launch the Maya integration right now, and you were to look through in the Ftrack menu, you would see opener, publisher, scene assembler. Those are all tools, and those are defined by what we call a tool config. Now, in previous versions, these were all JSON. Going forward, all of our configs are YAML files. So you will find, per tool, you'll find a config file that's, Maya scene opener.yaml, for example, or Maya publisher.yaml. And this does a couple things. This defines things like the appearance of the tool. So the widget that also provides the configuration for the tool. So if there's anything specific that's maybe either environment specific or user specific, some of that will appear in the tool config. And the plugin itself, in this case, is what encapsulates the logic. So the actual Python file that the tool is represented by. I guess it's probably proper to say that a tool is both a YAML file and a Python file. So the plugin is the actual Python code that you'll find in a tool that makes up the working part of the tool. So now that we've kind of got some basics, let's look at how this all fits together in the context of probably the most used plugins in which are our integrations. When you load Connect, that's probably the second thing you do. You go to the plugin manager, you say, hey, I want to use Maya with Connect, I want to use Photoshop, I want to use Premiere, so install all those. So what's actually going on, and what does that look like? Well, it has a few components, which we listed here, and we'll go into individually, and we'll touch back on some of the things that we've mentioned earlier. So we'll take a bit of a deeper dive into, for example, what an engine is or how a tool config works. But starting from the top, again, back to Connect. So the Connect plugin, we're exposed to the application launcher via, again, that app. And this essentially just configures our launch environments. So there's also a Python component, which is the actual plugin hook. And this is where you start to set up what the environment should look like when we launch from Connect. So for example, if there are custom environment notes that you need to pass in, custom environment settings, for example, this is where you would run something like a user setup from Maya. This is what the part of the code that explains all that. And if you remember when we're discussing actions and events, this is where you'll see subscribing to things like the discovery event, the launch event, and you can also subscribe to any other specific event you might need for your integration. So that's the first part of that. This is where kind of all the setup happens in the Connect plugin hook. The next level are the actual extensions. And these are, this is where we start to get into the actual functionality of the plugin itself. So as we mentioned, we have the launcher, which is, again, that Maya_launch YAML, which tells you things about the, so things like what version of the application am I launching? Things like where can I find the executable? So all sorts of just the basic bootstrapping for launch that Connect is going to need to know about when you click on that launch Maya or launch Unreal or launch Photoshop. The next level of that is the actual configuration file for that DCC. So this is where we tell Connect where all of our tools live, where all of our extensions live, what the name of the extensions are, for example, how they're to be presented. And then the last level of this is what we call again, we mentioned the tool config. So specifically what a tool config does is, a good example is say you have a standalone you have a publisher plugin in your integration that actually has to go through a couple of different steps. So one of the things you can do in the tool config is you can say tool config, this is the main tool that I want to expose all these functions as, and this is the order that I want you to execute the script in. And it actually manages, so it makes sure that the extensions are present and loaded. It makes sure that all the options are there. And then when somebody goes to the menu and clicks on whatever, say that entry in the Ftrack menu in your DCC is, this is how it knows, the DCC knows what to run, and Connect knows what to expose to that set of functionality. And as I mentioned, we do have an example integration where these are all very clearly lined out. So we'll provide that in the resources, and recommend that if this is a direction you're going, that you do go maybe go back over this once we publish the recording and kind of step through that code alongside of this, just to get an idea of what everything looks like and to familiarize yourself a little further with these concepts. So next, we have the actual working part of our tool, the extensions, and we have different kinds. So and probably these terms are all very familiar. You know, a plugin, what a widget is, what a dialog is. You know, the plugin is where the actual work happens. So if my tool is like my Maya opener, all the actual steps that I take when I open a file, whether that's setting up a reference chain, whether that's setting up a scene a specific way, whether that's pulling in specific assets, that's all in what we would call the plugin. And then as far as exposing that to the user, we have what we call the widget and the dialog, which again are pretty specific. The main distinction here is that what we call a widget is the widget speaks more to the Python plugin itself, whereas the dialog is what pulls options from the tool config and presents those to the user. So if there's a specific way you need to configure a plugin, you would have a dialog, and then the dialog would pass that information back to the plugin, which then the widget would take advantage of when you actually start to interact from a user level. And again, back to the engine, once we have all this set up and we're actually running our code, the engine takes over. And as we mentioned earlier, the engine is really what executes the plugins and the extensions per the flow that's set up in the tool config. But under the hood, it does a couple of other very useful things besides just managing the execution flow. This is where your error handling is going to happen, and we do actually have some custom exceptions that you can hook and check against. And as well, this is as the host and the client are communicating back and forth. This is the engine is what actually facilitates the event and catching the events and handling the callbacks, as well as this is what gives you the hook into those callbacks. And the last little bit of functionality we'll talk about, and this is the most we'll probably discuss code in this section, but we do have a couple folders. So we mentioned that we have a hook folder, but we also have a resource folder and a source folder. Not to be confused, the resource folder can be thought of as where a lot of the setup steps happen. So as we called out here, if you're familiar with Maya, this is where you would have a custom user setup, for example. It also has its own init script where that contains what we'd call the bootstrapper. So that's where you can start to set up a little bit of your environment information. And again, if you're using something like Unreal, you would set up your your paths. You'd hook your paths from your configuration files, and you'd send that to the environment, and you'd say, hey, this is where, for example, my init Unreal script lives. And then the source folder is what the resource folder actually points to. And the source folder, as you can probably imagine, is the main init point for the integration. So this is where we initialize the framework. This is where we set up our menu and initialize the menu, as well as tell the DCC app how to load the menu, which could be as simple as just calling a custom Maya menu script, or it could be as complex as something like say you have an environment like Unreal, for example, that doesn't use Qt and doesn't use Qt under the hood. It has its own UI framework. So this is where maybe you set up if you need to run your our menus on a sub process, or your custom menus on a sub process, or if you need to perhaps wrap, say, one UI framework for another UI framework. This is where you would do all that, and as well, this also is where your plugin source code lives. So. As kind of we did last week, this was kind of a whirlwind tour, and so we are now at Q&A. So if anybody has general questions about how the framework works, how to get to any of the resources, if there's a specific topic you'd like to discuss, let's go ahead and get into that.
And there's a chat panel, but there's also a questions panel. So use the questions one if you can. We'll give people a little bit of time to ask some stuff, maybe some stuff in situ.
Yeah, and as we mentioned, the deeper dive for now is on the Developer Hub. We have quite a few different sections on how to develop custom integrations, and that's everything from if you're an established user and you're thinking about migrating from Connect 2 to Connect 3, Framework V1 to Framework V2, we have a full guide on that as well. We have quite a few different little sample snippets, and again, the actual source code for Connect itself and our shipping integrations are available from our GitHub repo. We actually have a mono repo for integrations where all that code can be found. So if you actually want to just dive right in and take a look at what this looks like yourself, that's you have that option. And as I mentioned, Thursday, we'd like to offer maybe a more specific webinar in the next iteration of these, where we actually take apart a plugin or an integration, and we look at how to stand up the what it looks like to either build a brand new integration, or what it looks like to extend a tool or to customize an existing extension. So if there's a specific topic there that's interesting to you as a developer, again, please let us know, because right now the sky's kind of the limit for what we do for our next round of webinars. And like I said, we'd really like to start diving into specific topics. So yeah, let us know what's interesting to you, please.
And I haven't seen any questions come through yet, but we do have a couple minutes here if anybody wants to throw something in, or we can just call it early. I think we're good. It's Monday. People aren't jumping in, and everybody's getting used to the week still. So we just wrap it there. Thanks again, Seth, for your in-depth knowledge on everything here. This is great. Like I said, we're going to be posting all of these sessions on YouTube, so you can really start from scratch and reach out to your sales contact or your customer success contact or anybody that you have contact with. And we're happy to jump on with you guys. That concludes our series of training webinars on the API. That was 5 out of 5. Really appreciate everybody joining in, being active. Quick reminder that all sessions will be available. And I'd like to remind everybody that we have the bi-weekly Ftrack Advice Clinic, which is currently on pause for the holiday, but it is hosted live by our team. We cover more general UI questions there. Feel free to jump in and register. That will be ongoing every 2 weeks per usual. The next session is on January 15th. So we've got a little bit of a break for everybody here. And from the whole team over here, we really appreciate you spending your time with us. And I hope you all took something away during the training. Look forward to seeing you guys in the Advice Clinic or just on calls, and we'll chat soon. Thanks so much for attending. Have a great day, everybody. And thank you, Seth.
Yep, absolutely. Everybody have a happy holiday.